Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dora Meredith and I'm the Director of ODI Europe, based here in Brussels. We've got the joy of our very first hybrid event today. So we're both speaking to the camera, where I know we've got many colleagues and a large audience watching, and here in Brussels in the room. So thank you. ODI Europe is an independent global affairs think tank, and we undertake research, convening and advice to generate ideas that matter for people and the planet. I'm really happy, come on in, we've still got people arriving. I'm really happy to be hosting this event today. 10 years ago, the Belt and Road Initiative was announced and became the defining narrative and brand of China's engagement with the world, and particularly in its development cooperation with countries of the Global South. The third Belt and Road Forum will be held later this month in Beijing, as I'm sure you're all aware. And against this context, we are delighted to be hosting this important event today to take the opportunity to evaluate on the past decade of the BRI, its achievements and challenges, particularly for global development cooperation, and what that means for global development cooperation generally, and to reflect on the potential future. We're going to kick off the session today with a presentation by my dear colleague Yunnan Chen, before moving on to a fantastic panel discussion and a wider debate with the audience, which will also be taking place online. And afterwards, I hope that those who are in the room will join us outside for a small reception. So let's kick off. Yunnan. Yunnan is a research fellow in ODI's Development and Public Finance programme. Her work centres on the changing development finance architecture and the role of global China. Yunnan, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Dora. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to those of you in Brussels and those of you joining virtually. Before I jump into talking about the BRI, I wanted to give a very quick introduction to some of ODI's work in this area for those of you who may be less familiar with us. ODI has been a leading voice on China's engagement in the Global South. We bring together diverse expertise in trade, finance, investment, climate, as well as geopolitical risk. And our work looks at the impacts and the implications of China's economic and geopolitical influence for the rest of the world, and particularly for lower and middle income countries of the Global South. So our research, which I can't show all of it to you today, but spans very pioneering work on China's outward development cooperation, outward investment, particularly in Africa, its multilateral and bilateral development finance and debt issues, and also the geopolitical risks of China's rise. And I also want to highlight here that we're having an event on critical minerals as well next week, which I encourage you to look up. And as well as research, we also engage in convening events and also working directly with policymakers in shaping their understanding of China's activities across different regions of the world. And of course, within that, the Belt and Road Initiative has been a major feature and a constant running thread in ODI's work on China. So under the Global China 2049 project, which is led by our colleague Rebecca Nadin, we've produced several major reports looking at the social risks of the Belt and Road Initiative in partner countries, looking at case studies in Central and Southeast Asia, as well as a series of economic pulse reports that traced the impacts of COVID on BRI projects and their financing. We've also engaged in emerging work looking at modalities of China's lending practices via the BRI. So before we get to the panel, I want to get everyone onto the same page to give you a very quick potted introduction to what we call the Belt and Road Initiative, which encompasses many things. It's a very amorphous concept and is very, very difficult to pin down, but it's also important to situate it as the latest in a series of sort of grand strategies in China's internationalization and in its own sort of domestic economic transformation. This really started in the 1990s with the going out policy, that encouraged Chinese state-owned enterprises to go out, to seek resources, to build new markets. Over time in the 2000s, this evolved into the West policy that tried to shift economic weight away from the coastal regions to try and develop the hinterland. And eventually this culminated in 2013 in what was previously called in English One Belt, One Road, which was this idea of using trade and connectivity via Eurasia and Central Asia to then develop China's hinterland provinces. And eventually this grew to encompass the maritime Silk Road in Southeast Asia up to East Africa and basically beyond. So it's very hard to sort of see a region of the world that hasn't been folded into the Belt and Road Initiative in some way. And this has served strategic and diplomatic purposes for China in presenting itself as a provider of global public goods to the world, in securing particular trade routes and its strategic access to natural resources. But it's also, you can also view it as a spillover of its own domestic economic transition, where particularly we see this emergence of global China after the global financial crisis, where you have this domestic problem of overcapacity and an overheated economy, saturated infrastructure markets. And so the Belt and Road Initiative is the culmination of many, many trends that sought to export this surplus of capacity and export this surplus of capital as well overseas. So in this period, we see major capital injections into China's policy banks and financial institutions, which all serve then to support companies to go out and seek new markets and build infrastructure. And the BRI is also the export of a narrative, of a development narrative, the idea that infrastructure, trade, and connectivity, it can be a form or a foundation for economic growth and economic transformation. And happily in this period, the outward flow of Chinese capital coincided with the demand for infrastructure finance that came from countries in the global south who really didn't have that many alternatives. So this is a period where the MDBs had largely retreated from infrastructure finance. After the global financial crisis, traditional donors were a lot more risk averse to financing these kinds of projects at scale. And so China served a gap. And the focus of the Belt and Road Initiative, as these photos sort of illustrate, they're very much in this kind of hard economic infrastructure that we see at home. These are all areas of China's own industrial dominance, railways, hard infrastructure, hydropower dams. And a lot of this finance has come via lending, debt finance from China's policy banks and also commercial banks to a smaller degree. But when we look at the pattern over time of official lending, the diagram shows from the Boston University database over time up to 2011, the flows of lending from CDB and Exim Bank. But you can see over the period of the BRI a clear boom and bust in overseas finance. And this predates COVID. COVID perhaps is a nail in the coffin, but it happens at the tail of an already dramatic slowdown. And we've also seen that the BRI has had a bit of a lower profile in recent years. There's fewer mentions of it in official speeches, although this year will be the first high-level forum taking place since 2019. But also in 2021, we saw the announcement of a new global development initiative from Xi Jinping. And then following that, the Global Security Initiative and the Global Civilization Initiative. So there's clearly a diversification of platforms, or a desire to diversify the platforms by which China is engaging with the global south. And it's also no surprise to any of you to say that the BRI has become extremely controversial in recent years, particularly after 2017, where we, following the debt trap diplomacy narrative that becomes endemic in discussion around the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think whilst the risks of asset seizure that this debt trap narrative portrayed, I think that is overblown. That said, it's also true that BRI lending and debt has contributed to debt burdens in many lower income countries. So to understand some of the institutional drivers behind these trends, I'm taking the opportunity today to also present a preview and a few highlights from some upcoming work that will be published by ODI in the coming month. It's a paper from myself and my co-author Zoe Zongyuan Liu, which focuses on the role of Sinosure, which is an export credit agency that has been the main provider of insurance and de-risking finance for exporters, contractors, and creditors along the Belt and Road Initiative. It has a slightly lower profile, but along with CDB, China Development Bank, and China Exim Bank, it is one of the holy trinity of China's policy finance institutions that has undergirded the outward flow of finance via the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as overseas investment. And since its creation in the last 20 years, it has expanded dramatically in scale. We also see a shift, right? In the early years, it was very much a vanilla trade finance agency supporting the import-export of goods. And to this day, that remains its primary purpose. However, over the period of the BRI years, we also see a growing shift towards supporting the export of China's capital as well, going overseas. And increasingly in recent years, it seems to be playing more of an economic stabilization role. So the first contribution of the paper is to throw some light on this relatively understudied institution and to highlight Sinoshure's catalytic role in the overseas finance of the Belt and Road Initiative. So on the right, you'll see here this is from Sinoshure's annual reports, by the way, that its overall portfolio, the value of its international activities has basically nearly doubled in the last decade. And overwhelmingly, this is concentrated in short-term trade finance. And yeah, this makes sense. China is one of the biggest trade partners in the world. Every country almost in Africa considers China its largest trading partner. And a lot of this has been secured and underwritten by Sinosure. But within that trend, you also see the rise and fall of a small layer of Sinoshure's activities in the medium to long-term export credit insurance. And this small but significant layer of MLT is what has underwritten a substantial portion of the overseas debt and lending that has been extended by Chinese policy banks and creditors. And really, there's a very visible squeeze after 2018, and this coincides with the pullback that we saw in overseas lending from Chinese creditors. Our research finds that Sinosure coverage is seen as important and even essential for some commercial banks looking to invest overseas. It plays a slightly differential role with different banks. So with Exim Bank, Sinosure has been responsible for extending its portfolio and its ability to expand its lending envelope within certain countries. And it seems to take on the more high-risk end of Exim Bank's portfolio, whereas for CDB, ICBC, and other commercial lending, it seems to play a little bit more of a credit enhancing role. So those loans are smaller in volume, but they have a higher grant element to them. And clearly, Sinosure has a pivotal role in ensuring projects go forward. For some banks, very few are able to go ahead and approve loans unless there is Sinosure backing to them. However, because of its strategic position within the Belt and Road Initiative, we also highlight this trend of moral hazard as well that's come into play in Sinoshure's underwriting of overseas lending. Another contribution of the paper is that it tries to also situate Sinosure in the wider context of DFIs, ECAs, and MDBs that provide this kind of guarantee and risk insurance products for long-term investments in the infrastructure. And some of the charts that you see on the right kind of indicate, as again, by scale, Sinoshure's capacity to underwrite really dwarfs all of the other major institutions. And given its scale and given its integral role within China's financial architecture, this has been perceived as a fundamental challenge particularly to the OECD arrangement, as well as to OECD aid practices. Sinosure and China Exim Bank, the two ECAs, are not part of the OECD arrangement. They don't follow the OECD DAC rules on untying aid. In fact, their Exim Bank readily blends aid and export credit together in a form of blended finance that really undercuts the level playing field that the OECD arrangement was developed to support. And this challenge to the OECD regime has been one driver in this modernization process that we've seen over the last few years. And from 2023, the OECD arrangement has implemented some new laws in place to reform the terms of its finance that ECAs can now provide, allowing for longer tenors, and also with plans to reduce minimum premiums. Competition with China is one component in this, but a bigger driver is also this need to mobilize financing for climate investment and green transitions. And this is also an area where we see common convergence between ECAs, DFIs, and also Sinosure itself, although Sinosure is still playing a little bit of a catch-up role when it comes to adapting to supporting climate finance. And the Sinosure model illustrates the scale of mobilization that can be achieved with state-backed guarantees, but also lessons around the need for sufficient risk management, for sufficient capacity in developing good projects. And to date, guarantees and insurance instruments remain underplayed amongst OECD DFIs, MDBs, and ECAs, many of whom offer it as a part of a wider portfolio of products. But I think we're also seeing some change in this regard when it comes to, for example, the EU's use of EFSD plus instruments. So to wrap up my presentation before we head to the panel, the paper and this research on Sinosure illustrates a lot of these trends and adds another angle to them. We see the pullback from Sinosure in China's wider financial architecture as one explanatory factor in why the BRI and lending by the BRI has seen this cliff drop in the last few years. Sinosure coverage has shrunk, and clearly its appetite for risk has also shrunk. And the ability of Sinosure to extend the kind of guarantees that it used to in the middle of the decade do not seem to exist anymore. Instead, we're seeing this shift to what's called small and beautiful, or small and smart projects, and a new focus on the Green Belt and Road Initiative, which is also becoming an increasing integral part of Sinosure's mandate as well. And so this raises the question of also whether Chinese finance in the future can also be mobilized to support greater green investment. And just to conclude, on some of the future directions of research happening at ODI, infrastructure finance is going to be one of the key areas that we'll be looking into going forward. And in the context of a slowed down Belt and Road Initiative and the withdrawal, it seems, of China from financing some of these big mega projects, what do new infrastructure initiatives mean for this global landscape and the continued demand for also climate investment from the global south, and also continued research on how China's domestic economic transition and the continued relevance of China's capital flows, and what does this mean for industrialization and economic transformation in the global south. And I will conclude here. I think my colleague Linda is just going to attend. Yes.
Could you please show us the last slide one more time, please? Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes.
I have a question on the previous slide when you said that medium to long-term assets represented a portion of the backed investments from the Chinese ECA infrastructure project. And I couldn't clearly see the numbers. My understanding was around 20 billion, just to get a grasp of actually how much ECA is backing infrastructure project against other types.
So you can see that in the total proportion. Unfortunately, the orange and red is not very good for contrast, but this is the proportion of medium to long-term insurance cover. So it's very small, right? But in the context of the amount of lending that it's been able to mobilize, this has played a very, very significant mobilizing role.
What does that mean? Does that mean that banks lend without ECA guarantees?
It means that banks are generally very unwilling to lend without an ECA guarantee in some cases. And we're talking about Chinese banks here. And so for many of these commercial loans that have been part of the Belt and Road Initiative, Sino-Shore backing has played a very pivotal role. I mean, this chart.
20 billion years is not much. So
It shows how powerful it is.
Sorry, I have an update. So Dora, who was supposed to moderate, is being unwell.
Okay.
So we will have a slight change of plan, and I wonder if you now would mind moderating the discussion.
Sure.
If this session is complete, then we can move into the.
Yeah. Shall we bring the panelists?
Yes, please. And sorry for the inconvenience. Okay, you open all this. Do you think we can have the panel here, please? Want to sit there, maybe? You prefer this one? Yeah, that's fine. Just come here. Also here. Yeah.
Thank you for bearing with us whilst we make some maneuvers.
Yeah.
Okay. So I won't thank myself for that great presentation, but thank you for staying with us and being patient. And we're really delighted now to be joined by a distinguished panel of speakers. So firstly, I'll introduce Her Excellency Ambassador Grace Asirvatham, who is the Sri Lanka ambassador to Belgium, Luxembourg, and the EU. And she has previously served for 35 years as a diplomat and international civil servant. Secondly, His Excellency Ambassador Bitange Ndemo, who is Kenya's ambassador to Belgium and to the EU. Before assuming his current diplomatic assignment, Ndemo served as a distinguished professor of entrepreneurship at the Faculty of Business and Management Sciences at the University of Nairobi. Thirdly, Lynn Gertels is director at the European Institute for Asian Studies. She is also an associated researcher and lecturer on the EU-China Political and Economic Relations at the ENSSCA School of Management and the EU-Asia Institute in France. And finally, my colleague Linda Calabresi, who is a research fellow in the International Economic Development Programme at ODI. Linda is a development economist by training, and her research interests include industrialization, economic transformation, private sector development, and also the role of global China. So thank you all for joining us. So firstly, I'm going to turn to Ambassador Asirvatham. So Sri Lanka has become, in popular media, very strongly associated with what we discussed earlier. This narrative around the debt trap, and the Hambantota port has been used as a case study for this. And this has been, dissected by Sri Lankan and foreign experts. But beyond the headlines, I want to ask you, what has the BRI represented for Sri Lanka, and what has the government and also the people achieved from it? And from your viewpoint as well, what have been some of the main challenges?
Thank you very much for this opportunity for me to express Sri Lanka's views at this forum, especially on the first decade of BRI, and also to envision its path forward for future. And this is a monumental project. And before I go into Sri Lanka BRI relations or our involvement in BRI projects, I would like to give you some information about our bilateral relations with China. That is very important. When you look at our involvement in this monumental project, you should also see how our relations have been built between the two countries. And Sri Lanka and China share a very rich diplomatic and cultural exchanges that span over 2 millennia. And also historical records document that we had, relations dating back to the ancient Silk Road, which really facilitated trade and cultural connections between the two countries. So our relations were not established in the recent past. And then one of the primary connections between Sri Lanka and China was Buddhism, which is very important. Buddhism originating in India, it spread to Sri Lanka and then to several parts in Asia, including China. So from China, those days, from China, the Chinese pilgrims and scholars, they visited Sri Lanka to learn about Buddhist scriptures. And they wanted to study the island's monastic practices. So that really brought together the peoples of the two countries. And then Sri Lanka was one of the first South Asian countries to recognize China in 1949. And, although we were following non-aligned policy at the time, we wanted to have relations with all countries, regardless their political ideologies. And then we established diplomatic relations with China in 1957. Interestingly, before we established diplomatic relations, we entered into a trade agreement with China in 1952, which is called Rubber Rice Pact. So that was a kind of a bond and also an indication that we were going in for a larger economic cooperation. So that's how we could see, because when you look at the way the relations were being built between the two countries, having an agreement, trade agreement at that point of time in 1952 was something very special between the two countries. And from ancient Silk Road connections to contemporary economic collaborations, these relations have withstood the test of time. And these relations fostered growth and development. Moreover, both countries actively cooperated in the international forums. Even now, up to now, we have been cooperating with China, and China is helping Sri Lanka. So that relationship is very important for us. And also, we are very responsible international community members. We cooperated in the international forums, upholding the principles of multilateralism and also shared global responsibilities. And additionally, on the relations side, I would like to say that now we have increased people-to-people contact through tourism, businesses, cultural exchanges, education, and so many people visit Sri Lanka. So many people from China visit Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lankans visit China. So this is something we should say that we can say that this is the high point in any relations, people-to-people contact. Political level, diplomatic level, cultural level, you can have anything through arrangements, agreements. But when people-to-people contact increases, that means you're achieving or you're increasing your relations to a real-time level. Having said that, now we have to focus about Sri Lanka's involvement in China's BRI infrastructure projects. Before I go into that, I would like to say that you all know that Sri Lanka's journey towards economic development was hindered by terrorism for 3 decades, 30 years. We suffered because of terrorism. And we were able to successfully eliminate terrorism, defeat terrorism in 2009. And you can imagine, after 30 years of war, we wanted to develop our infrastructure. We wanted to promote economic development, but we didn't have the modern infrastructure. And you all will agree with me, you need to have the infrastructure, road connection, highways connections, and all other infrastructure for economic connectivity with other countries. It's a competitive world. Globalization was at peak. How could you trade with other countries when you don't have internal infrastructure? So that was the situation. And against this backdrop, the Belt and Road Initiative emerged as a compelling option for us, offering a platform for substantial investments in vital infrastructure projects. And it's kind of a God-given for us. Therefore, as I said before, the decision to join Belt and Road Initiative stems from our aspiration for economic development, infrastructure enhancement, and regional connectivity. Additionally, participation in the BRI aligns with our dream or our ambition to become a hub in the Indian Ocean for commerce and connectivity in the region. That is still our dream. And joining the BRI took us one step ahead. Oh, that was also one of the reasons, because to have connectivity, you have to have connectivity infrastructure. And BRI offered opportunities for critical investments in Sri Lanka's infrastructure, including port, airport, highways, expressways, roadways, and also energy security, energy-related products, which are essential for economic growth and trade facilitation. At the same time, we also faced challenges during our infrastructure development with BRI. Sri Lanka, as you all know, Sri Lanka really was exposed at the academic and political level. At times, we feel this is because of geopolitical reasons. And our Hambantota port has served as a valuable lesson in the need for careful evaluation of projects, comprehensive due diligence, and sustainable debt management before entering into large infrastructure projects, ensuring that they are economically sustainable. This is the lesson that we learned from these funding assistance that we received under BRI. This one project really raised our awareness, because that was the first time that we were going into such large-scale infrastructure projects. It can go wrong, but it was not forced upon Sri Lanka. You know, we asked for this project. This project was not proposed by China. This project was there for a long time. Twice we did feasibility study, internal feasibility study, and also external feasibility study sponsored by other countries, Western countries. And I don't know whether I should go into detrap now, or whether maybe in 1 or 2 minutes I can wind up, then maybe another opportunity if you can give.
Yeah, maybe we can wind up and then we will save the
Right.
debt trap discussion.
So as we move forward, we must also strike a balance between our ambition and fiscal responsibility. We learned a lesson. It's for us. It should not be used under any circumstances to support their geopolitical views or ambitions. And with this, I will stop and then maybe I will take questions. And I would like to say something more about data diplomacy because it started with Sri Lanka. So I would like to come back to you, but for the time being,
I'm sure
I will stop. Thank you.
We'll get a lot of questions about that, Mrs. Ambassador. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn now to Ambassador Nemo. So Kenya, of course, has also been another major partner along the Belt and Road Initiative. We've seen flagship BRI projects in the form of the standard gauge railway, the Lamu port. It's an important node along what's been called the Maritime Silk Road. But China is also not the only partner for Kenya. Right? There are other development partners that have played a critical role in the development of the Northern Corridor, for example. So to go broadly, what have these 10 years meant for Kenya's development strategies? How has the BRI shaped Kenya's interaction as well with the EU and with other development partners?
Thank you. And I think my colleague here has summed up almost similar experiences that we've gone through, and it's like a growth process. Kenya was colonized by Britain, and even after independence, worked very closely. Almost all our exports went to Europe, and most of the initial development after independence was largely from the Western world, borrowing from the World Bank and other agencies that IMFs and other stuff. But it didn't work. In the 80s, 90s, when we had the structural adjustment programs, which completely plunged the economy into complete failure. I mean, it didn't work because the prescription for Africa was that focus more on import substitution, and Asia focused more on export oriented. Of course, our partners removed infrastructure from part of the financing, completely plunging even within East Africa, infrastructure development was not there. So when China came and the BRI is informed with the initial investments that China started to make in the region, and they found that actually we could do more with this. And I'm sure they are now looking at how can we do more because of what we are hearing, especially opening up the interior of Africa and exploiting some of the resources, which even now, after the Western world, I've seen what China has done, the policy has changed towards infrastructure. We are discussing infrastructure with the EU at the moment. We didn't discuss infrastructure with the US. If some of you watched when the UK Prime Minister was in the US with Joe Biden, Joe Biden said, "Oh, we're gonna come together and build a road across from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean." This is something that is in the cards with the Chinese, that if we opened up this space, a lot of Africa's interior has got a lot of resources, which are very critical resources. What we are discussing actually at the moment about critical resources. So the Western world is now waking up to the fact that China helped open up the space to see some of the things that we were not able to see, that some countries in Central Africa didn't have complete or no infrastructure. But Kenya benefited because of its proximity within the Eastern Africa. We had the ports, And we were looking towards how to develop the interior by connecting even within East Africa to put up the infrastructure. The former president, President Moi, fell out with the Western world. And I think there were allegations of corruption. And when he fell out, the President Kibaki came, who was his deputy, and he says, this fate we are facing East now. If you had asked a small question, who has been the best performing president of Kenya, it would be Kibaki, simply because he found the relations with China actually benefited Kenya. That Kenya moved from a low-income country to a lower middle-income country within a very short period of time. The absence of conditions from Chinese loans, and something I say that the West even now are making mistakes by getting too many conditions. I mean, I know, for example, the problems that we had at the time was that it was a prescription that you take. Right now is, oh, we can work with you, but we have to look at these issues of LGBTQ. There is not a single politician in Africa who would go and tell his people that, okay, we are doing this. Of course, Kenya's constitution allows anybody can do what they want to do. But these are conditionalities which are nothing to do with development in itself, which are completely outside. I'm saying this because it's probably going to affect and if we're talking geopolitically and give China a space to actually dominate where they could easily have had very easy discussions with Africa. I want to finish because you are looking at me differently. Yeah, but what are the benefits? What are the benefits we have seen? China actually opened up into regional trading. We will say it helped us to begin integration. And as we begin to talk about Africa Continental Free Trade Area, is because you can link into many countries that we never used to link before. Even Ethiopia, which is a neighbor, South Sudan, we never used to have infrastructure. It has opened up trade between the countries. We import a lot from Tanzania because that work was done. We expanded our airport. Most other countries can bring their exports through Kenya because of the expansion of the Chinese funding. Chinese funding did a lot of work, especially in the ICT sector, that the region has become synonymous with IT and other stuff. Then I think because of that, of course, the economic growth arising from the investments in that space. So I stop here so that I don't make mistakes.
No, I'm sorry if my face seemed a little critical. I mean, the next question that I wanted to ask, and maybe this we can say for the next round, is sort of, now that we're in an era where the BRI has slowed down, official financing has slowed down, and we're not seeing the same willingness and scale from Chinese finance that we did before. You know, how can we continue to develop on this sort of progress and this trajectory in your respective countries? But before we get to that, I'm going to turn to Lynn, who brings a viewpoint from Brussels, or perhaps more of a European perspective, if I may say so. I mean, how do you see the impact of the BRI on the global development landscape then, here in Europe and beyond? And what do you see as the challenges in how the initiative has been implemented around the world? And also, since we are in Europe, what are the lessons for how European partners can engage with global South countries?
Yes. But of course, I mean, the title of the event is already looking back and looking forward. So I think actually that's a really, I mean, that's a key phrase, and I think that's what we really need to do. And looking back at the 10 years of the Belt and Road Initiative, I think you've already highlighted it. There's a lot of changes that have already happened. I mean, at the time when the Belt and Road Initiative was launched, which was still at that time One Belt, One Road, as it is in Chinese, 一带一路, basically, at that point, nobody really knew yet what it was going to be. It was launched as a big project, as a big initiative, but it was more a concept that still had to be filled in. I mean, I had people, Chinese officials, local officials actually asking me like, what should we do? So, I mean, I think over the past 10 years, that concept has grown. And I think it has also grown upon China to a certain extent, as well as on the beneficiaries. I think, of course, I mean, China has therefore also gained some leverage in the beneficiary countries. I think, well, of course, it is still mainly infrastructure based, which is not always the case for other initiatives from the European perspective. But I think also compared to like traditional development operational aid loans that have been provided by more Western donors to a certain extent, I think China has taken a very different approach. And I think that has been the major issue, or the major thing that has challenged other existing initiatives. I mean, China has a more of a business take on it, a bit more market driven and like contract based, which was less the case for others. I mean, initially, I think the projects were mainly high risk and high return approach. As you've mentioned, I mean, that has changed a bit, and it's more like small is beautiful at the moment, and it's more like really quality based, and they have also shifted that to a certain extent. I mean, the high risk, high return approach has maybe failed in some cases, but I think it has also like been highly beneficial in others. So to that extent, I mean, China should also be given some credit, at least, despite the challenges that have been in place. I mean, I think, well, the quality of the finalized project was not always up to par with the expectations. But I think, I mean, that and other criticism have been addressed over time to a certain extent. But I think that has also changed a bit over the past 10 years. I mean, I think China's approach is mainly very different. It's more like a partnership, a contract. I mean, it's less conditional, as you've mentioned. It's more like, well, what can we do for you? And this is the contract on the basis of which we're going to do this. Of course, it's up to the countries themselves to accept it or not, as you have mentioned. I think one of the main things that China has been doing by the BRI to a certain extent is, of course, the Global South has been voicing quite a bit of concerns and frustrations with the existing multilateral governance system, the way development cooperation has been taking place. And so to a certain extent, you also see that with like the BRICS expansion and the interest for BRICS and other initiatives. And like, so they're trying to find some solutions to a certain extent. And I think that is a big challenge for Europe, for instance, as well as other Western donors. So, I mean, China has kind of provided a bit of an alternative. And I mean, and now there is choice. So the question is more like, how are we going to respond to that? And how are we actually going to come, to come across that bridge that, the Global South, the countries in the Global South are actually asking for, more of like a partnership. They want more agency basically in their development. And I think that is a challenge in like the existing system right now and how to address that. I think, well, to be honest, I actually believe that the Belt and Road Initiative itself is probably more a response to the existing changes than in international development and the global, multilateral systems, rather than the other way around. So, I mean, to answer your question, I think it's actually more that the BRI itself is already like a response. I mean, yeah, I think, basically, there are some, these were the dynamics that were already in place. And I think China found some alternative and used the BRI actually to respond to that. Rather than the BRI, like other aspects being a response to the BRI. I think that came later. But I think that was a dynamic that was already in place. So I think it's probably China's answer and response rather than anything else. I mean, I think like there's also like the question more from countries in the global south that they want to have that agency and that, I mean, responsibility to a certain extent for their own development, and not only being expert countries for raw materials, for critical materials especially, but also to be able to provide that added value to products and to really like economically develop. I mean, for that you need infrastructure. So the question is, how can we actually match that, and what can we do with that? I think, well, for people, of course, the most important part is that the roads are being built. Who does that is probably less of an issue for the people in the street. So, I mean, the road is there. It's more important to actually make sure that the quality of these projects and the infrastructure is in place. And China has been offering that alternative. So how can we actually match that? I think, well, if you look at, I mean, the challenges also to a certain extent that the Belt and Road has come across with, or China in particular, I think we've already mentioned like the economic slowdown in China, and that also will have an impact on, I mean, its lending, on its spending, and its approach to a certain extent. We already see like a different in the different kind of projects that are there. But I mean, I think that also like the pandemic has accelerated that. I think one other issue with the BRI in particular is that the concept itself and its vagueness about what is included and what not is sometimes a bit of a point of a discussion. I remember also discussions, for instance, with Nepal in like the airport, is it now part of the Belt and Road Initiative or not? China sometimes claims it is, Nepal did not. So, I mean, it's more like what is the BRI and what is included and not. So some clarity on the Chinese side might also be necessary there. I think if you look at some of the countries, the disillusionment with promises that had been made on the BRI and projects that had not been met. After a while, I look at particularly to a certain extent to the Central and Eastern European countries to a certain extent, with the 17+1 initiative, which has now been scaled down to a certain extent. So the problem is also like, I mean, with a lot of promises, you might not always be able to meet those. So I think a wise choice in the projects is probably in place to actually bridge that expectation gap to a certain extent. Of course, like the quality is going to prevail, and that needs to be up to standard, whether it doesn't matter who provides the infrastructure. I think also like especially initially, there were some issues with the Chinese approach to these projects, bringing workers, equipment from China only, and bringing less of real development and jobs for the countries themselves. I think that has to a certain extent also been a bit addressed in the meantime, but there might be some other things that could actually be done to improve that still. And then of course for the debt trap policy, but I believe that we'll be going into that a bit further afterwards. But I think the main thing is how are we going to react to that? And therefore, of course, I mean, the question is more like, what are the needs from the countries in the global south? I think coordination with China will be needed rather than actually to look at them, I mean, or the BRI in particular as like a competing initiative. It's more like what can we do together and how can we match things, or what can be synergies? I think that is probably a better approach, and like coordination rather than competition. I think, well, the EU, of course, has the Global Gateway. We have the Global Gateway Forum coming up as well, which is going to take place, I think, after the BRI Forum. No, but it's more like, okay, it's also a thinking process and an approaching like, what do we need to do and how can we actually, I mean, move forward? I mean, but I think, well, that's the main issues. And I think the demand is coming from the global south. More how are we going to respond to it?
Great. Thank you so much, Lynn. And finally, turning to Linda, you've done a lot of research on the impacts of Chinese capital on the ground. So after 10 years, can you tell us a little bit about what the evidence says on in terms of infrastructure investment in energy, transport, that's really typified the Belt and Road Initiative? What is the impact of this kind of investment for economic development in these countries, both positive and negative?
Thank you, Yuna. Yeah, I'm going to bring my perspective as a researcher, even though I'm, very humbled to be sitting on this panel where I've heard a lot of interesting things. I was like frantically writing, basically. So I think, there's a lot that I can still learn on the topic. But in general, I think like trying to assess the impact of such a complex thing is very difficult. So when the Belt and Road was announced, within the next couple of years, a lot of studies were published that say, Belt and Road, this is going to increase like GDP of this country of 2%, it's going to increase trade by 7% and whatnot. Like there were a lot of these kind of studies circulated, and the World Bank has done a lot of that work. And I think those were all relying on assumptions, specific assumptions that the project is going to be completed, that's going to be completed on time, that projections are actually correct. And what we have seen is that in the course of the past 10 years is that actually the projects and the projects that form part of the Belt and Road have evolved a lot. So some have been cancelled, some corridors have been reshaped, some price tags have been reduced. There's this famous example of the port of Chopio in Myanmar that was supposed to be a sort of $7 billion project. And then the government of Myanmar, the previous government of Myanmar, the National League for Democracy government, wasn't particularly happy about it. And so they went and renegotiated the price tag and sized down the port and so on. So a lot has changed compared to those early studies. So it may seem like a platitude, but to actually understand the impact of the Belt and Road, you have to look at the country cases and other project cases and to look how each of them has played out on the ground. In general, we can say definitely, and we can see also a lot of infrastructure has been built. I was reading some figures for Africa. 6,000 kilometers of railways, 10,000 kilometers of roads have been built. I mean, this is a massive increase in the infrastructure offer. Energy infrastructure has been built as well. So countries that were previously importing energy are now producing and actually exporting. And with that, energy costs have gone down, transport costs have gone down, transport times have gone down as well. We know that the Belt and Road has led to job creation. A lot of these projects have not only meant that people were employed in the projects locally, but also that a lot of industries were stimulated, cement, construction materials, and so on. We see a lot of like these industries really like growing in many countries where infrastructure is now being pushed. And we've seen also some extents of technology transfer where countries have learned how to build and how to operate some of these infrastructure projects. And of course, we can debate, to what extent did that go? Was this technology transfer or knowledge transfer as deep and profound as it could have been, or a bit less? I mean, that depends on the cases, but certainly we see some sort of positive impact. And at the same time, we also see some negative impacts. And those are the ones that always take the headlines and that we hear a lot about, right? So projects being built in reserves or protected wetlands or national parks. We know that there have been protests against coal-fired power plants where local communities didn't want that type of project in their area. Similarly, for social outcomes, we know that particularly local communities have not been happy about the benefits of the projects to them, meaning they don't perceive the benefits to be as big as they could have been. So very often, for example, a Chinese company will go in a country and hire local workers. And so for them, local workers just mean workers from the country. But sometimes for the people in the community, they actually want people to be employed in the local community, not people from the capital going to work in a project in a specific area, right? So also the understanding of what is the social benefit of the Belt and Road changes depending on how you look at it and who's looking at it. And then, of course, one of the main challenges that we know is the debt sustainability challenge that, maybe will be discussed a bit later, but the main point there is projections were made at a certain period of time, and maybe these projections were too optimistic, or maybe they were done at a point where countries were feeling themselves feeling optimistic. A lot of countries had maybe natural resources revenue. We're talking about the early 2010s or late 2000s, when there was this commodity boom, where there were a lot of natural resources, where prices were high. So countries felt very confident that, you know, we can borrow now and then we can repay. And maybe things didn't go that way, or not in all cases they went in that way. So there have been some challenges in that sense. But from my viewpoint, I think rather than breaking this down, it's important to also consider this more in general, like holistically. What has the Belt and Road led to? So infrastructure has been built, but has that contributed to growth? Has that contributed to a change in the way an economy works, a change in the way, you know, like a change in the way an economy, for example, produces, and so on and so forth. So, you know, you now have more energy, or you now have more transport routes. Do you use those to export more? Do you use those to produce more? Is that what has happened? There have been studies. For example, I was recently reading a study on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. That's one of the flagship projects, or one of the flagship corridors of the Belt and Road. And the study said basically, there's been a lot of stuff that's been built here in Pakistan, but it's not been transformational, because Pakistan is such a big country, and even all of this money going towards infrastructure has helped a little bit, but you don't see that that has translated into economic growth. You have the infrastructure, but you need to use it somehow. And to me, that's a key point, right? So a lot of the narrative on the Belt and Road relies on this model, on this idea that you build infrastructure and then growth comes. And it kind of relies on, you know, there's this Chinese saying, you build a road first, you build a road to get rich, basically. You first build roads and then get rich. And this is a false narrative of the Chinese story. So of course, infrastructure was super important in the Chinese case, but China became a country that, you know, radically transformed its economy in the past 40, 50 years through not only infrastructure, but also agricultural modernization, industrial development, strong emphasis on knowledge transfer, strong emphasis on human capital to absorb all the knowledge from the foreign investment that was invited into the country. So my takeaway kind of, you know, on the Belt and Road discussion is, it's great to have the infrastructure. You need the infrastructure, you absolutely need it. I mean, I think it was made clear, but that's only one part of the story. So you need also, the infrastructure is not an end, it's a tool. So you need to use that to actually then invite the investment, promote not only foreign, but also domestic investment, and promote, you know, that sort of like transformation of the economic structure that allows the country to then generate sustainable growth rather than just building the infrastructure and leaving it there. Yeah, I guess that's my sort of key message on this.
Thank you so much, Linda. And in the interest of timekeeping, for which I will take the blame, but I want to ask you all the same question, and I want to get a 2 to 3 minute response, as concise as possible. And then we're going to turn it to the audience questions. So in 2 to 3 minutes, I want to ask you, will we still be talking about the Belt and Road Initiative in the next 10 years? And what will be the major challenges that we need to confront in the immediate coming years? We've already discussed the fact that debt is becoming a growing issue. Interest rates are very high right now, and maybe we can't sustain the same kind of infrastructure finance that we could in the earlier decade. But what does this mean for the Belt and Road Initiative looking forward? Ambassador, so welcome to you.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. From our point of view, we think that BRI is likely to remain a central topic, maybe another 1 or 2 decades. And we also would like to see that to have that prominence, the BRI concept itself should evolve according to the priorities of the countries. And also we will have to see it should be contributing to the current and future goals, I would say common goals, which are promoted by international organizations. Now we are talking, always talking about climate change, how the BRI is going to accommodate climate change related issues, SDGs related issues. It should not be always about the connectivity. And one fine day, you will realize there are no countries wanting to have infrastructure development in their countries. There, it will be, it's not a open-ended, project. One day it is going to close. So you have to look for other areas where you can shine. And also, another point I would like to raise, since you have given me 2 minutes, there are other similar projects and initiatives coming into the field. And one is about the European program, Global Gateway. And likewise, other countries are also trying to give similar initiatives or projects to countries in the neighborhood. And everything is based on what is happening in the area of geopolitics, globalization and all that. And so, we need to see whether BRI will withstand that and whether they can change their programs. They cannot continue their program at the way that they have been performing, and the focus and scope should change. Thank you.
I'll come this way. So Linda, perhaps to you.
Sure. So I think that's a very interesting question, because if you had asked 10 years ago, in 10 years, we're still talking about the Belt and Road. I think a lot of us would have said, no, like this is just a name, this is just a fad, and we don't really even understand what this is, right? Like we don't understand what is this, why does it, change names? We don't have a list of projects. We don't know what is Belt and Road, what isn't. So going by that and thinking that, those sort of questions have been disproven, I think in 10 years, we'll still be looking at something that has this sort of like Belt and Road kind of label or framework. But what will happen is that it will look quite different from what it is today. I mean, the concept itself has evolved quite a lot. So you've shown the kind of evolution of the names, the nature of the financing and so on. And I think there's been a lot of learning from the Chinese side, learning from, stories around the criticism around the way they lend, or criticism around the impact of some of the projects. And this small and beautiful trend, for example, is now a response to that criticism. So as things evolve and go along, I think a lot more issues will arise in the way infrastructure is being built and financed. And the Chinese constructors and lenders, but also others, will learn from those issues and will try to improve. So we will look at something in 10 years, but it will be slightly different and hopefully better for the countries that receive and host the projects.
Thank you so much, Linda. To you, Ambassador.
Thank you. I would agree with them. If you look at the history of development, when the British and the French were fighting over textile industry, learning from one another, I'm trying to bring in theoretical assumptions that when you are a monopoly and others see, they would get into the space and minimize your earnings. So what you're seeing happening in Africa now, Ethiopia is looking into a structured relationship with China, where there is technology transfer, where they lessen the number of Chinese who are working. The same thing South Africa is looking at the same thing. Anything at that magnitude is like marriage, there is a period of adjustment. You begin to understand that you can negotiate some things. This is what is happening in Africa now. We can negotiate with the Chinese on this. The good thing that can sustain China longer is that they are not interested in advancing their ideology. They can work with you as capitalists, and they don't care what you do. They can do what they're doing ideologically at home, and abroad they're doing a different thing. Europe is coming with a global gateway. For them to be competitive in this space, they would have to do a few adjustments, and that would happen. India is coming up because of their popular technologies, and some Asian countries. What US did to Korea and other things, So this is development has never been that you can wake up from somewhere and they develop. If it wasn't for Nixon, China would not be where it is at the moment. They said, we'll give you technology, forget about these Russians. And then they flourished from just that meeting that Nixon went to China. And this is going to happen. There will be competitors. They will probably have a better world where there is a competition.
Just to come back to
Yes.
you on a very minor point,
Yes.
you mentioned the EU Global Gateway, and of course, I think there are many of us in the room and beyond who are quite interested in this as well. You mentioned adjustments, so could you sum up in brief, what do you think is the key, if you were to give advice to EU policymakers, what are these adjustments?
Not as an ambassador now. You brought me here as an academic. People might say I'm doing things which I'm not supposed to do. I said earlier that Europe should not be the moral policeman of the world. And the moment they realize that once people develop, they also aspire to be like, it would happen at some point. But to put it ahead, it gives room for others to come in and say, forget that nonsense. We are here, we can help you with this. So this is, I hope you have understood what I'm saying.
I'm sure the message will travel home.
Yes, thank you.
And finally, then, will we be talking about the BRI in 10 years' time?
I think I agree that we will still be talking about it in 10 years' time, but as we have seen over the past 10 years, indeed, maybe in a different format or a different kind of projects or a different kind of approaches, that probably, I think is a good thing, that these projects evolve, also the approach, and that they actually respond to existing needs, to existing criticisms and challenges to a certain extent. So to that extent, I think what we need to look at in particular is, the infrastructure. Of course, there's still a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built, but once the infrastructure is built and is there, what do we do with it? And I think that's the next step. And actually integrating that also in a bit of a bigger framework, and moving beyond just having the infrastructure being built. So I think to that extent, there's also like a role for the EU in terms of, maybe not as a policeman, of course, but more in supporting, well, maybe technology transfer to a certain extent, but also in terms of capacity building and helping support and developing these roads and what to do with them.
You see what the US has done, very high tech to India to shut up China. So the competition is the best thing for us who are developing.
That's a great final statement to end this round of questions on. So I know you've all been sitting patiently, so I'm going to throw it open to the room and also to online viewers. Somehow we will also get your questions, but to the people in the room first, does anyone have a question for the panel?
So it's a question for Mr.
Please, could you stand up and speak into the microphone? And if you could just give your name and affiliation.
Hello, my name is Travisol, and I work as a consultant for a company and I analyze the value chain studies across Africa. So working on industrialization. And regarding the question of cooperation, that's what I've noticed on the ground. It's that essentially companies cooperate. For example, there's one rail line between London to Italy, with mines all along the rail line, which are Chinese owned, Singapore owned, Indian owned. That line is owned by Congo, French and US government, and they're renting the line towards these companies working. And at the same time, they're opening up a second airport so that Chinese can export minerals that they have mined in one. So, and the second example is Jekami, what happened to Jekami that you have seen, where in 2008, the World Bank in Belgium, USA, promoted its privatization. At the same time, capitals from Australia, from Zambia, from Belgium came in, bought it, and then sold it back to the Chinese. And then the Chinese operated those units. And so Jagamin broke down into 15 mining pods around, and actually now in 2023, out of those 15, 13 are Chinese owned. So essentially, I think, in my opinion, BRI is a pragmatic approach to economic development, which actually, like you said, follows capital flows from China. Essentially, at least a few countries I've been to, I noticed that they were pragmatic answers to export raw materials they extracted from mining wood, and actually to import the goods that they sold in countries. So a BRI exists as long as China is an economic superpower and will import minerals and whichever commodities from the world, export is goods to the rest of the world. I think it will rely on infrastructure to advance its commercial policy.
Did you have a question for the panel?
And so my question is, how do you see that cooperation between capital flows from you or whichever other country that you can now see for, and the capital flows from China? Do you see cooperation on the ground? Do you see companies talking to each other, investments being designed by companies to work together, for example, a rail line to export commodities, mineral work, electrification lines to for industrial zones, setups, and this kind of thing. So do you see cooperation?
Are there any other questions? The gentleman in the back.
Ambassador Antonia.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This is the ambassador message. I'd like to congratulate on the sentence for the good way they've made their presentation very clear. Allow me just to put it more clear, maybe I did understand the way the second presenter made it on the need for infrastructure and the use of those infrastructures. Portray the message like sometimes there are infrastructures which are not used properly. But for the case of Africa and most of the countries that I understand, we really need infrastructures to advance our economies. Most of these infrastructures are well designed. Most of the time, the designing is done by the local. They are done with the real needs of the community. So I've never seen in my experience in my country, the infrastructure that has been put there without any use, being road, being whatever kind of use. So maybe you have cited in some countries, but I cannot say for those ones, but I want to assure you that the infrastructure that constructed, whether by BRI, are well designed and they are really addressing the needs of our people in that area. Now, my question is to the lady, second lady, after. Yeah. How do you see the BRI and the global gateway converging together? How do you see it? Perspective of Europe or whether global? Because it is an EU initiative with more than around 300 billion euros globally and around 150 billion euros for Africa. And how do you see it converging together or competing? Thank you.
Great. Unless there are any other questions, I'm going to turn the mics back to the panel. And I guess maybe we'll start from Ambassador Asivatham again and come around this way.
Yes, the first question about cooperation. And what we do is that we give such large projects to individual countries, but still they can collaborate. And one example is that we have Colombo Port Project. It was built on a reclaimed land of 269 hectares. And once reclamation is finished, now we want all other countries to come and invest in infrastructure development within the port city. This is going to be a kind of an international finance city. So that is one example of collaboration. Chinese will also be there. The BRI, it's a BRI project. Chinese will also, it's 100% investment, and they will be there while they are doing their part of development. Other countries can also invest in that project. So that is one first question, answer for the first question. The second question raised by Ambassador, it was about infrastructure built and not used. I don't want to cite examples, but there may be white elephants. You know, you think something, you have feasibility studies, but at the end of the day, you cannot operationalize such facilities. It takes time. So for some time, it will not be used. So I don't want to go into details, but you know, we have seen such situations. And then BRI and Global Gateway, how it could merge or converge. I would say that Global Gateway is a very recent concept. It was finalized in 2021. Now they have some pilot projects, and BRI has completed 10 years. It's very rich in experience and also faced a lot of criticisms and challenges. And BRI is trying to go ahead with their second phase. And Global Gateway, you know, can learn from their mistakes. And, you know, debt sustainability is one thing that we want to emphasize. And also we should see that the host country, it is not only the host country's responsibility. The lender should also see whether the host country can return the loan, whether it is sustainable. And that is one aspect I think Global Gateway will look into. And environmental aspects, sustainability. And it should not be, these projects should not be affecting the environment, which is very important. So these two aspects, I think, Global Gateway has already accommodated in the concept. And but you know, the geographical scope, objectives, everything is different. You know, they look similar, but they are distinctively different. So you know, what I see is Global Gateway will be a competition. Will create a competition in the field of providing assistance to the needy countries, vulnerable economies, those countries which require not only infrastructure development assistance, even to, as I said before, reaching SDGs. And here I think if the Global Gateway gives you good conditions, then people will turn to Global Gateway. And also, on the downside, you know, after 10 years or 15 years, people will look at the infrastructure projects completed by BRI and they will see whether they are performing, whether they are helping the country to, you know, develop their economies. If they are not, and if that traps them into a bad debt situation, then they will have to see whether they will have different options to look for. So this is what my reading about these two initiatives.
Thank you, Ambassador. Linda.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very interesting one and one that pushes us to reflect a lot, you know, with how can, you know, infrastructure planning be improved? So I'm going to give you one example that comes from a country, your neighboring country of Uganda, which is a country where I do a lot of my research. So one of the sort of most visible projects in Uganda, at least for those coming outside, is the road that connects the Entebbe airport with the capital city, Kampala. Of course, there's a similar road in Kenya, an expressway in Kenya. I don't know the story that well, so I'll speak about the Uganda case. So that road is great for people who fly into Uganda, want to reach Kampala. It used to take like 3 hours with all the traffic to reach the city. Now with the expressway, it takes, around 1 hour. So it's fantastic, for the city elites who want to travel in or out. The project costed around 400 million USD, so quite expensive. So now the question for me is, how are you gonna get that money back? That road is not very much used. So when you travel on that road, there's actually like not so much traffic. So the question is, how are you gonna get the money back? So you have two ways. One way is you charge fees for people who use the road and use that to repay, but that's going to take a very long time. And then if you charge too much, people are not going to use the road. And so it's not a great way of doing that. And the other way is the road serves some companies, and the companies hire people, and then the companies pay taxes, and then the people who are hired by the companies also pay taxes, and then they buy things. And so overall, like, there is a growth in the economy. So for me, as an economist, the way I see this project being beneficial is spending those 400 million, not on a road that connects the airport to the capital city, but on a road that connects, for example, Kampala to the industrial zone in Mbale, which is a new, actually Chinese-built industrial zone where there's around 5,000 people working. So connecting that industrial zone to the market is actually, to me, a better way of spending the money. So my sort of point is, I'm someone who studies industrialization and economic growth. So my point is always like, use these projects not to make life easier for a few people or more comfortable for some tourists, but to actually like promote investment, generate further growth. You can then use those returns to repay the project rather than thinking sort of using fees or other ways.
I know we're at time, but given that I assume everyone's going to stay for a drink or two afterwards, I'm going to take the liberty to let the next two panelists conclude their questions, hopefully brief, and then any further questions can be asked over a drink.
They answered the question so beautifully. I wanted to answer his question, but then I forgot. What was the question?
The question of cooperation between capital of the link between capital flows and infrastructure investments, capital flows in industry or services, and how can European companies or American companies or Chinese companies and Indian companies cooperate together, for example, within especially economics.
Actually, if you go to Lubumbashi, the Elon Musk is doing batteries there and Chinese. Them being together, they end up building capacity because you fire here, they go here, or the infrastructure itself for mining and other stuff. I think it's going. Private companies don't have a problem where you come from. It is the policymakers who have a problem, and that is the area we need to talk about. My brother has asked a very good question on this, which we're trying to respond here. But let me say that that we have a real chance to have a collaboration between the two. But there are some things which keeps on putting us aside. Let me say, I risk my job and say
Sure.
that people get tired of promises, 15 years ago, we told people you have to have a democratic government, everybody, whatever. The Sahel got tired. I mean, they started now saying anybody can work the same way. Same thing. You can only give promises for so long. All I'm trying to say that we can work on the global gateway to actually be competitive, where execution is faster, and the partnerships. Because at the ideological level you can be, but on the ground you can. Americans do it very well, but they use very beautiful words around how they cooperated and the stuff. I think Europeans need to learn from the Americans.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Yeah.
Finally, then.
I'll keep it short. But I think it's mainly, I mean, coming back to what you said, I think it's mainly about connecting the dots. Looking at the Global Gateway and the BRI, I think especially the Global Gateway, I mean, it's already a continuation of the connectivity strategy for Asia, which it was before, which has now been expanded. A lot of different things have been brought together, and was it 300 million that has been allocated to it. Is there? Some projects have already been identified. I think a lot more are on the way, and feasibility studies are also on the way. So I think it will be expanded, and the question is more like how to merge them and how to see like what the synergies and what coordination could be happening between them in the execution, but I think also in the planning and monitoring phases to a certain extent. I think in the green transition and the sustainability aspect, there's a lot of work to be done still. And I think, and that untapped potential should be looked into more concretely, I guess. I think dialogue, coordination, and also in the choice of projects and identifying the partners there is going to be key.
Okay, so I'm afraid we're at time, so I will apologize to those online for running out of time to take your questions, but to thank you all again in Brussels and joining us virtually for taking the time to sit with us. And please join me in thanking our panel again for their fantastic interventions.